Today we're going to begin the sermon in Revelation chapter 22. Revelation chapter 22. So we're going to begin at the end. Revelation chapter 22. Now, as you get to Revelation chapter 22, and it's the very end of things. Revelation chapter 21 speaks of God the Father returning to the earth. A new heavens and a new earth has been established. And everybody who is going to be in God's family at this point is already a part of that family. And whatever God has for us in the future is still a mystery. What's going to happen and what exactly takes place beyond this point, we don't know. We will be spirit beings. We will be a part of God's family. And God will be dwelling here in the new heavens and new earth. And we will move forward from there. And we don't know exactly what the tasks are, but we do know one thing, that God, the law of God, is constant. We know that because you go to Revelation chapter 22, and let's go down to verse 12. Revelation chapter 22, verse 12, it says, "Behold, I am coming quickly, and my reward is with me to give to everyone according to his work." So the awards that will be given to those people who are a part of God's family will be given out based upon your works, based upon what you have done in this life. Have you yielded to God? Have you allowed God to complete his work in you and prepare you for the kingdom of God? So as we have grown to the very stature and fullness of Jesus Christ, we will be ready to serve in God's kingdom, and that will be opportunity, and Christ will bring the rewards with him. He says in verse 13, "I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last." So who is this speaking? This is the one that we know as Jesus Christ. If you go back into the Old Testament, he designated himself to be "I am that I am" when he was speaking to Moses. "I am that I am has spoken to you." You might know that as Yahweh. That basically means the one with no beginning and no end. It basically means the same thing. It's not a formal name. It never has been. But it is something that... thank you, Mr. Corley. There you go. Okay, we have, before we go on, one further announcement. Mrs. Bowery is feeling somewhat better and getting around somewhat better. She thanks you for your prayers. Mrs. Bowery's daughter apparently caught a respiratory infection from her and requests our prayers as well. So please pray for Mrs. Bowery's daughter as well. So anyway, we see here that Christ is the Alpha, the Omega, the beginning and the end. The Old Testament, he would be referred to as Yahweh or Yahweh, whatever the spelling would be in the Hebrew. And it basically means the eternal. The eternal is a good, succinct way of expressing what that means. Revelation 22, verse 14. It says, "Blessed are those who do his commandments." So we have God's commandments, and God didn't just give them to us to read and contemplate. He wants us to do his commandments. It says that, "And those who do his commandments are those who might have the right to the tree of life and may enter through the gates into the city." So who has the right to the tree of life and to enter into the New Jerusalem? That is, those who have done God's commandments. And he also tells us in verse 15, "But outside, not able to enter that city, there will be individuals who will not be a part of what goes on in God's kingdom. They won't be a part of it. But outside are dogs and sorcerers and sexually immoral, and murderers and idolaters and whoever loves and practices a lie." So those individuals will not be a part of God's kingdom. They will not be a part of all of the wonderful things that are going to be beyond the time when God the Father returns. What will it be? We don't know exactly. But it is going to be wonderful what God allows to unfold, and we're going to be very much a part of it. So God, as you see here at the end, the commandments are quite important to God. And they're going to be They're eternal commandments. They're reflected in God's character, and they're to come to be reflected in our character as well. Now, let's go back to the beginning of the book, back to the book of Genesis. And so you see at the end, God brings up the law, talks about it being the criteria by which he's going to reward those who will be a part of his family. They have yielded to him. They've allowed God's Spirit to work in them and to write God's laws on their very heart. And they're going to be a part of his family forever. Now, we go back to Genesis, and we'll begin in Genesis 1. And what we find as it talks about the creation, that God created the heavens and the earth. As he did so, God established clearly and discernible natural laws to govern everything. So from the very beginning, the physical universe came into being, and God established laws to govern it all, to govern the entire physical creation. And those laws are ones that we can observe and experience, and we're accountable for them. For instance, you have Isaac Newton, who supposedly was sitting underneath an apple tree, and what happened to Isaac Newton? The apple fell on his head. I'm not sure whether that's the truth, but it's supposedly that apple fell on his head, and he decided, well, isn't that interesting? Gravity causes that to fall, and so gravity is a law. It's something that is common in life. If I jump off of out of that tree, I'm going to fall just like that apple did. So he began to investigate that natural law. As you think about this, the study of physics, that particular school of study is a study of the natural laws that man has discovered. And there are laws that govern at what temperature water boils. There are laws that discover, you have laws about vacuums. You have laws about a variety of different physical things in this world. Many of those laws are designated by the person who found that law, who discovered that law. It's not that they originated the law, they just happened to discover it, and their name is associated with that. Like Isaac Newton's is associated with gravity. You also have Albert Einstein, who's associated with E equals mc squared, and those kinds of very deep things that are part of the physical world. But God is the one who originated all of those laws and caused them to function in the world in which we live. For instance, as you go through and you look at, beginning in verse 3, you look at the recreation. It talks about light there. And as light is something that has very specific, distinct, and discernible laws that govern it. Light travels in a straight line. It travels at 186,000 miles per second. Light is governed by a law, by the laws that God established for it. You go down a little further to verse 9, and verse 9 speaks about the waters and the land. And you have the land, and you have all of the elements that make up the land, and you have the water. You have fresh water, and you have the oceans, and water is something that seeks a level. So you have the oceans that are in this depression, these depressions in the earth, and it seeks a level. And the oceans are also affected by the moon, which causes the tides to flow in and flow out. But there are very clear and discernible laws that govern water. Water is something interesting because it can evaporate and it can condense. We can have water which can, when it freezes, it expands. And interestingly, you freeze it in a glass, you have the water to the very top, and it's over the top of that. You think, well, it's going to, once it thaws, it's all going to drip out the sides. Well, amazingly, it fit into that glass before. It'll fit into it again once you thaw it out. And so water is quite an extensive, an interesting thing, and we know that plumbers love water because it seeks its level, doesn't it? And it all flows downhill, and plumbers appreciate that very much. You go to Genesis chapter 1, verse 11, and it talks about plants. God created the grass, he created the bushes, he created the flowers, and he created them with certain characteristics that are common and that govern them. For instance, we appreciate all the plants because they operate by photosynthesis. So they take what we exhale, carbon dioxide, and they take it in and they process it and produce what they need to grow and sustain life. And they give off what? They give off oxygen. They give off oxygen, which is essential to all of us. So we're very thankful for plants, and I'm sure the plants, if they were able to be thankful, would be thankful for us, giving off all that carbon dioxide. So God established that, and it works wonderfully in God's system. And as you go down a little further in Genesis chapter 1, it talks about the sun, it talks about the moon, and it talks about the stars. And it talks about the sun and the moon and the stars, and by especially the sun and moon, we're able to calculate days, weeks, months, years. There's a regular pattern to their orbit. The moon travels around the sun and also travels around the earth, doesn't it? We all orbit that big orb, the sun. And we're able to go around the sun in 365 and a quarter days. And that happens regularly. We count on it. The sun sets, the sun rises. We're very used to that, and God set up that order. And the only thing that cannot be discerned in the heavens, as you look out there, we can see the sun, we can see the moon, we can see the stars. We can see the sun rules the day and the moon rules the night. But the one thing that we cannot discern as we look out into the heavens is the 7-day cycle of the Sabbath. You can't discern that from looking at the physical creation. God simply ordained that. God established the Sabbath by saying this is the way it's going to be. A week is 7 days, and on the 7th day, that will be the day that you congregate. And there's no solar or lunar reason for that. There is no sign in the firmament for a 7-day week. The fact that we do it is simply going back to what God established in Genesis chapter 2. God established laws that govern the world in which we live. The entire book of Genesis recounts the creation and the laws God established in the natural world to govern them. God established water creatures and birds. And as you look at water creatures and birds, they all have certain characteristics. You have robins as an example. They lay blue eggs. They have a red chest. And they make the same kind, every robin makes the same kind of nest. There's not an innovative robin that says, you know what, we're going to break the mold here and make a different nest. They don't do that. The same thing with, the different birds. They all follow the same pattern. And that's the way God created the sea creatures. You have salmon. You have salmon. They're hatched in a certain place. They go down the river to the ocean, and eventually they make their way back up to the place where they hatched. There is not a salmon who says, enough of this, we're not going to go up there and commit suicide. We're going to start our own empire here, the salmon empire, and do something completely different. It's not happening. They do that, and they struggle and make their way back up the rivers, and eventually many of them make it back to where they started, and they die, and the process starts over again. Why? Because God created them with certain instincts. God programmed them to be the way that they are. You go on to the 6th day of creation, and God made creeping things and land animals. Cattle reproduce after their kind, just as the sea animals reproduce after their kind, and all of the plants reproduce after their kind. If you plant a seed of corn, you're going to get a stalk of corn, and ultimately, if everything goes well, you'll have an ear of corn, from which you can save that and you can start the process over again. But when you plant corn, how many of you have gotten cherries? Or when it doesn't happen. What you plant is what you get. Everything reproduces after its kind, whether it's plants, whether it's creatures in the sea or in the fresh water, or birds. They all reproduce after their kind, as do all of the land animals. Dogs produce dogs, cats produce cats, and there is some variance in their DNA from Chihuahuas and dogs up to Great Danes and huge dogs, but there's not much variance. There's only a certain amount of variance there. And you know what? Every dog that I've ever seen, when they come in and lay down, especially in the evening, what do? They start circling around, and then eventually they lay down. And they start scratching to try to fluff up their bed. I'm not sure exactly what the point of that is, but they scratch and then they do the circle and then they lay down. I've never figured out why my dog does that and what benefit there is. He even does it on the carpet, and he's not able to scratch that up and fluff that up much, but he does still do it. So it's something that's been programmed into them. And, my dog is not thinking about being a beaver. Probably your dog isn't either. He's a dog, and he's satisfied with that. And animals, so I'm a cow, I'm a bull, I'm a tiger, they're all satisfied with what they are. And they don't question that. But God created something different beginning in chapter 1, verse 26. So everything is programmed to function in a certain way. There's a little bit of variance in there. Dogs do have different personalities, but cats have different personalities. There are a little bit of variance there, but not much. They're still cats and recognized as such. But in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, there's something that God created that is different. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God said, I'm creating you in my image. And just as I can think and I can plan and I can think outside the box, I can think about different things, I'm going to allow you to do the same thing, and you're going to be able to oversee all of the different creatures on this earth. They're under your dominion. Now, how you exercise dominion, that's the question. But they are under your dominion. How will you exercise that dominion? So we're created in God's image, and man was placed over everything to oversee it and to exercise godly dominion over it. Verse 27, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. So as he says there, they're male and female, and as male and female, they are both created in God's image. They're both created in God's image. God created them with differences, but they're both created in God's image, both with the same potential. And God said, bless them. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. So God gave them the dominion, and God said to be fruitful and multiply. And God has given all these things to you for food, and God made them different than the animals. So there's no way that they're like an animal with just instinct. For instance, the animals do what they do. If you've ever had chicks, and the chick hatches, the chick eventually pecks its way out of the shell, and what does it do? It finds its way out of the shell, it climbs out, and by the time it climbs out of the shell, it's tired. So what does it do? It lays down and takes a nap, and then it gets a nap, and then it's up, and what is it doing? It's doing what chickens do. It's pecking and looking around for food and water. And that's what it's going to do for the rest of its life, looking around for food and water. Its instincts take over. But as a human baby is born, that's not what happens. When a human baby is born, that baby's going to come out of the mother's womb, and in about an hour, it's going to be up and walking around and cooking dinner for everybody. If you have such a child, I'd like to meet them, but that's not the way it works. Babies don't have those skills, those abilities. Babies need care, and so God has given them parents that are to take care of them, to teach them, to feed them, to watch out for them, and to provide for them. That's how God set it up. And babies need time to grow up and mature. And animals don't need that. They have rules that they operate by, but humans and their children are very different. We don't tell animals, thou shalt not commit adultery, or you shall honor your mother and father. That doesn't register with them. I've told my dog, don't attack the postman, the UPS guy, or the FedEx guy. But you know what? If I'm not watching him, he'll attack all three of those people. So he just goes by instinct. He sees them, and he's automatically agitated, and if he has access to them, he's going to make them afraid. And, I've explained to him, don't do this, Steve. Steve, you're being a bad dog, and you're going to get me in trouble here by doing that. And Steve just, he kind of cowers at the moment, and he's docile and submissive. But you know what? Next time they show up, he does the same thing. So they're animals. They don't get it. Whereas you can tell your child and work with your child, don't do this. This is inappropriate for you. Don't say this. And they can eventually understand. You may have to keep repeating it, and you may have to work with them, but they have the ability to understand and implement what you ask them to do. And what God tells us in Genesis chapter 2 is that He established laws for human beings. He established laws for animals, but they're programmed in. God established laws for human beings as well. We see this in Genesis chapter 2, beginning in verse 15. So God established a garden, and He established in the garden the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And in verse 15 it says, Then the Lord God took the man and put him in the garden of Eden to tend and keep it. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, Of every tree of the garden you may freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall surely die. In the day that you eat of it you shall surely die. So God began giving instructions to Adam, because he did not have the instructions pre-programmed in him like animals. And so Adam was told not to take of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He was to dress and keep the garden. And Adam was commanded what he was to do and what he was not to do. And Adam had a choice. He had a choice whether he would follow God's instruction or not. Animals don't have that choice. They have instincts, and they simply go and do what their instincts tell them to do. And he was told that you shall surely die in verse 17. It says, But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall surely die. So Adam had a choice. He had free moral agency, something that dogs and cats and other animals don't have. He said, You shall surely, in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. So what does that mean? What does it mean? In the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. As you think about the story of Adam and Eve, they ate of the tree, so that did they die in the next 24 hours? We know from looking at the Bible that that didn't happen. Sometimes a day can mean a year in prophecy. Did Adam die within a year? He and Eve, they didn't die within a year. Sometimes a day can mean 1,000 years, which ties in with the 7 days in God's plan of salvation. Did Adam die within 1,000 years? He actually died at 930 years of age. So he did die within the 1,000 years. In the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. And some understand that's what that means. But let's look at some other scriptures that maybe will give us some more insight into that. What does the Bible say of death and how it comes to us? How is it that we die? And we're condemned to die, as it talks about here in Genesis and elsewhere. In Romans chapter 3, verse 23, it says, All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. All of us have sinned and come short of the glory of God. It also says in the book of Romans in chapter 6, verse 23, the wages of sin is death. The wages of sin is death. And I think this verse helps us to gain a better understanding of what God meant when he said, In that day you shall surely die. When we sin, we earn something. We earn a wage. When we're righteous, we earn something as well. That's going to be the basis of the rewards that we receive at the end. The Scriptures tell us that every man will be given according to his works, and this is something that is very difficult for people to understand, because human beings don't want it that way. Human beings want it to where they can have eternal salvation. Yes, you get eternal salvation, and on the other hand, at the same time, they want to enjoy the pleasures of sin. So you have the best of both worlds: eternal life, the pleasures of sin. But that's not how it works. And it's something that's hard for people to understand. What people don't realize is that the pleasure of sin carries a very heavy price. We'll see that here shortly. And God's laws are in effect always. They're always in effect. And if we break those laws, then we suffer the consequences of breaking those laws. God's laws protect the family and the individual, and they bring real liberty as we put them into practice, not punishment. The wages of sin is death. And that's a little, we can understand what wages are because we receive wages. But we don't understand wages in the sense that Paul was speaking of in his time. What kind of wage system, payment system was Paul talking about? We all have checking accounts. We have, if we earn a wage from many of our companies, it's automatically deposited in our account, isn't it? And we have paychecks weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, depending on who we work for. And that's how wages work for us. But that's not the way they worked in the time of the Apostle Paul. As we saw, the wages of sin is death. And what that word wages there in Romans 6, verse 23, refers to is the wages that were paid to a Roman soldier at the end of each day. A Roman soldier was paid at the end of each day. That's how things operated back in that time. So if you were a worker in the time of the first century, you would be paid at the end of each day. To me, that seems like an onerous way to do things, but that's how they did it. And so they paid the person at the end of each day. If you look at some of the parables, it talks about somebody agreeing to work for a penny, and the other people agreeing to that, and at the end of the day, they were paid the penny. And if you think back to the time of Ruth and Naomi, you were paid at the end of the day. Ruth and Naomi were out in the field gleaning. So they were out going behind the harvesters, and whatever the harvesters left was free for them to take. And whatever they gleaned, at the end of the day, they were able to take, it was theirs. They were able to take it home. That's how things operated then. So they received their wage from being out in the field and gleaning each and every day. So Paul is saying the daily wages of sin is death. Every day that we sin, we earn the wages of death. That is the wage for sin. So in that day that Adam sinned, he earned the wages of death. And what God said to Adam was, in that day that in the day that you eat thereof, the wages of that day is the death penalty. So we sin, and each day that we sin, we earn the death penalty. That's the reason that it's important for us to go before God and to repent, in order that that wage of the death penalty is not going to be paid out, and we're going to be reconciled to God. If we go back through the history of the laws for men, we find that the book of Genesis is truly a book of law. We've seen that by the natural laws that God established. You find that as God brought about the original creation. And we find laws already beginning to be explained in Genesis chapter 2. It talks about the Sabbath, which is a law. And you go on a little further in Genesis chapter 2, and God said, if you do not follow my command, you eat of the tree that I have set as off limits, you will die. The wages of sin is death. So they had to be breaking, to not follow what God tells you to do is sin. So God establishes physical laws, and he also establishes laws that govern mankind, spiritual laws. And those laws exist, and man has a choice to follow them or not follow them. He has free moral agency. And we find in the rest of the book there are clearly laws in place. Now, they may not be codified. I mean, when you look at Genesis, where are they codified? Where are they written down? We don't have a tablet of stone on which they were written down. But the laws, as we'll see, very clearly existed. The reason we need to understand this about Genesis and the law is this, because there are those who teach that there were no laws, there were no commandments, there were no statutes, there were no judgments until Exodus 20. None of that existed until Exodus 20 and Israel was out at Mount Sinai. So, if you remember back pre-1995, we heard those very points made and emphasized to all of us who were in the church. Those laws didn't exist until Mount Sinai. So at Sinai, God gave laws that were harsh, they were evil, they were oppressive, they were impossible to keep. And after they couldn't keep the laws, Jesus Christ came to do away with those laws and put things back to the way they should have been. And Jesus kept the laws on our behalf. Or he removed the commandments altogether. And the Apostle Paul was used to reinstitute what we ought to be doing as Christians. The argument, as you think about that, and that particular argument, it falls completely on its face when we understand that in the book of Genesis we can see clearly that there were laws in effect. There was an accepted system of law at the time recounted in Genesis, a system in place not only among those whom God was calling, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph, and a few others, but it was also in place for other people, as we'll see. It wasn't just Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob who followed those laws, but there were others that were not being called that kept those laws or were seeking to keep those laws as well. We will see them acknowledging the commandments in certain incidents. Let's look at some specifics here. Let's begin with Cain. Cain was angry with God because his brother was being favored. So he nursed that anger until it eventually erupted. And what did Cain do? He killed his brother. And then so he killed him. God confronts him and says, where is your brother Abel? And Cain said, am I my brother's keeper? I don't know where he's at. So first of all, right there, we have murder and we have lying. And God tells him, I know you're lying because the blood of your brother cries out for vengeance. You took a life and it cries out for vengeance. And who was the avenger of blood in that time? It was God. God makes him aware of that. Let's go to chapter 4 and look at verse 10. Chapter 4, verse 10. It says, and he said, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. You have violated my law and killed your brother. So now you are cursed from the earth, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it shall no longer yield its strength to you. A fugitive and a vagabond you shall be on the earth. So God said there's going to be a consequence to this. You're going to have difficulty producing food from the ground, and you're going to be a vagabond. You're going to be on the run, basically. In verse 13, and Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Woe is me! How can this punishment come on me? Well, it came on you because you killed your brother. There's a consequence to that. And Cain was cursed, and he was going to be suffer some consequence to that. But it's interesting, God did not impose the death penalty on Cain. He had the right to do that, but he didn't impose that death penalty. But God's law would exact the death penalty on all of Cain's descendants, as we'll see. So God allowed Cain to live, but he was a fugitive. He couldn't bear his punishment, and basically he saw himself as a victim. He saw himself as a victim, which is very common if you visit prisoners in prison. Many of them, it wasn't me, they got the wrong guy, I didn't mean it, I had a bad childhood, whatever it may be, there's an excuse why people commit the crimes they commit. And Cain had that very mindset, and you still see it today. Human nature has not changed a great deal since the Garden of Eden. And Cain, verse 14, Cain knew that as a result of the murder of Abel, there would be people who would seek vengeance. And so God put a mark on him to make sure he was protected, and God said, if anybody kills you, there will be a penalty for that. So what we find is this: the society that was built by Cain did not have a death penalty. Apparently, they did not punish their criminals. And within a very few generations, what do we find? We find that mankind was evil continually. Mankind was evil continually. Mankind became completely evil. That brings us down to Genesis chapter 6, verse 5. Genesis 6, verse 5. It says, "Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great." What is wickedness? Isn't it sin? How could you measure wickedness if there is no law? There are no commandments. There are no statutes, none of that. There have to be laws and statutes and commandments for there to be a measure of wickedness. And God could clearly see that the world was filled with wickedness. The wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. So man had become so corrupted that his thinking was filled continually with evil thoughts, plotting. And, if you haven't recognized it, Mr. Radcliffe talked about the world in which we live, and we're becoming the world that was found at Noah's time. It's a world where the thoughts of man are only evil continually. And it's a sad, sad world and a sad, sad condition. But that's what happens when you allow people to live without laws, to live the way you want to live. That is the consequence, and that is what is unfolding before our very eyes. Man was not operating by the laws that God had given man to operate by. Instead, everyone was operating by his own instincts, doing that which was right in his own eyes. And man was deciding what he wanted to do regardless of what God said was right and wrong. And since there wasn't a system that penalized those who were evil, it eventually turned into a vicious free-for-all. Dog eat dog, no rule of law, chaos, survival of the fittest, might makes right. It's always amazed me the people that want to be their gang wannabes. You want to be like the gangsters. Why? All you have to do is go down to where the gangsters are operating and see how they're operating. It is a dog-eat-dog world. And why do I want to live down there? Why do I want to go through that? I'm not going to survive down there to begin with. It's dangerous, and it's a serious thing. I don't want to live like that. So in Genesis chapter 6, it had become so bad, you have to realize God created man. He saw his great potential, and he wanted man to realize that great potential. And then we get to Genesis chapter 6, verse 5, 2,000 years into it, and God said, I'm sorry that I've made man. Look at how corrupted he has become. Look how corrupted he has become. It grieved him in his heart. And what's interesting, we see verse 7, it says, So the Lord said, I will destroy man. Okay, we can understand this because his thoughts have become only wicked continually. So he's going to destroy the man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man, he's going to destroy beast. creeping things and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. I don't have the answer to why God said he was sorry that he made them. Had they in some way become corrupted as well? I don't know. I don't know exactly what that means. It's a puzzling thing, but God said, I'm going to wipe out man, and I'm going to wipe out the birds and the creeping things and mankind. We can understand why God would destroy man, but why the rest of the creatures. What's interesting, as you think about this, Cain did not suffer the death penalty, but with the flood, all of Cain's descendants were wiped out. All of Cain's descendants were wiped out. There are none left on the face of the earth at this time. Only the descendants of Seth survived the flood, and only one family of the descendants of Seth. So we are all descendants of Seth. We're all descendants of Noah. And Cain's family was wiped out. So we have God giving the death penalty to all of the corrupt pre-flood society and all of the animals along with it. There came a point when God was so sorely disappointed in everything that he felt the best thing is to wipe it out. So what God did is he said, okay, we'll take one mating pair of all the unclean animals, and we'll take 7 mating pairs of those that are clean, some of which you can eat, some of which may be needed for sacrifice. And God also executed the death penalty, which he had not done earlier. So we come down to verse 18. So we see here that God is judging them and condemning them because of sin. They were breaking God's laws. And God was going to end their lives physically. And God was able to do that because God knew there is a coming second resurrection. It's not over for them. There is a future for them. And God reserved the right to allow that future to go forward. Chapter 6, verse 18, God says to Noah, "But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall go into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you." So 8 people went into the ark, and they went through the flood, and the ark eventually landed on Mount Ararat, and we come to Genesis chapter 9. Genesis chapter 9, it's interesting because remember there was a covenant that God made with Adam, and be fruitful and multiply, have dominion over the earth. And look at what God says. He said, and remember, God said he would make a covenant with Noah. And that same covenant, the covenant that God made with Adam, is the covenant that God establishes with Noah. Genesis 9, verse 1, "So God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, 'Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth.'" Same thing he told Adam, wasn't it? And then he says in verse 2, "And the fear of you and the dread of you shall be on every beast of the earth, on every bird of the air, on all that move on the earth, and on all the fish of the sea. They are given into your hand. You are to have dominion over them." Same thing that God said to Adam. And he was to have dominion, as Adam and Eve did. Verse 5. Verse 5 says, "Surely for your lifeblood I will demand a reckoning from the hand of every beast. I will require it." So if you have a cow that gores or a tiger kills, then you're going to take the life of that beast. God said, "I will require it." And from the hand of man, from the hand of every man's brother, I will require the life of the man. So if you choose to take a life, then the price that will be paid is your life will be taken. God established the death penalty here immediately after the flood. It's the first law that God established after the flood. There will be a death penalty. It says in verse 6, "Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed, for in the image of God he made him. And as for you, be fruitful and multiply, bring forth abundantly in the earth and multiply in it." So I want you to multiply, not be killing each other. And if you you kill, you're going to pay the price for that murder. And God established that as the way things were going to be after the flood. So God clearly establishes a death penalty. God knew, because there was no death penalty and no system of justice that was set up before the flood, how necessary it was as he began again to establish those things, because he did not want things to break down to where there's only evil continually. When you don't deal with crime and sin and evil and wickedness, what's the result? It's like leaven. It's going to continue to expand. It's not going to diminish. It's not going to just go away. You have to deal with it, and God set that up. A system of justice, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, where the punishment fits the crime. So if you knock out my tooth, you're going to pay me the price for my tooth. If you kill someone, you're going to pay the price for that. A life for a life. That's how the system works. And that's not how our system works today. Our system is, we feel that we're enlightened. And the reason that people commit crimes is because they had a bad home life. They commit crimes for varying reasons, and we don't exact the penalty. And as a result of that, yes, should there be mercy? There should be. But there's a time when you've got to exact the penalty, and that's going to be the best thing for them and society as a whole. But we've become too enlightened to go down that path. So we can see here clearly, as the flood came to an end and life began again with Noah and his family, there was a law against murder. God also entered into another covenant with Noah, and that is the covenant of the rainbow. God wanted man to know, I'm never going to destroy the earth with a flood. It's not going to happen again. Not going to ever happen again. And every time you see a rainbow, that's reassurance that that's going to happen, that there won't be a flood. Won't happen. So let's move on to another character in the story here, Abraham. We learned that in Abraham's time, there were laws of marriage and laws against adultery. And what's interesting is that these laws are acknowledged by everyone that comes into contact with Abraham and his family. There's no question about it. So how is it that these laws came about? Did they come about just by happenstance? They just evolved as man evolved? How is it that these laws came into being? Could it be that there was actually a design? Someone actually laid these out as the guidelines for living? Let's go to chapter 12 of Genesis. Genesis chapter 12 and begin in verse 14. So there was a famine, and Abraham went down to Egypt. Verse 14. So it was when Abram came into Egypt that the Egyptians saw the woman, that she was very beautiful. And the prince, so Abraham comes into the land, they see his beautiful wife, and so they say, this is a good-looking woman, and and there was interaction between Abraham and the people of Egypt. He was probably a trader, and in the trading process, they came across Sarah, or Sarai at this time. So the princes of Pharaoh also saw her and commended her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken to Pharaoh's house. The Pharaoh will take this lady, and they took her to his house. And it says, he, that is Pharaoh, treated Abram well for her sake. He had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female servants, female donkeys, and camels. But the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. And Pharaoh called Abram and said, what is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did it matter if there are no laws, no statutes, no judgments? He obviously knew there were laws that related to marriage. And he's saying, if I knew that she was your wife, I never would have brought her into my house. Wouldn't have happened. But you told me she's your sister. So I figured, no problem. No problem. You wouldn't be married to your sister. And so, why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister? I might have taken her as my wife. Take her and go your way. He's saying, I might have committed adultery. She's your wife. You didn't tell me the truth. So we have him lying, which is a sin, and we have him worried about the law of marriage. So very clearly, this king of Egypt, a Pharaoh, understood this. He understood it clearly, and we see here the lying as the breaking of a law, and the breaking of the seventh commandment was something that people understood. It's interesting if you go back to the archaeological discoveries that they found in the ancient civilizations in the Middle East, in Mesopotamia, and in Egypt and Babylon and Syria, we find what are called steles, S-T-E-L-E-S, which is a large oval square block, or maybe oval rock or egg-shaped rock, placed in an upright position. It would be a monument. And on those rocks were carved laws. You know, interestingly, back in ancient times, they understood maybe if we set up the laws on this piece of stone, we have them carved into this piece of stone, where everybody walking by will see it. It will be a reminder to them that there are laws that they need to follow. Now, if you don't realize it, in our world, we've said, we don't want any of that. Knock down all those monuments, remove all of those monuments. Somebody might be offended. Somebody might see it and say, maybe I should follow the things that are on that. But that's not the stage we're in at this time. So the ancients wanted their laws for all people to read. And they would often put up these steles up at the beginning of a town or on the town square. The most famous stele is that of the Code of Hammurabi, a king of Babylon around the time of Abraham. And there are many of these steles that have been found. And what's interesting about these steles is that they have been found, and as they've looked at the laws that are on them, they're very similar one to another. They're not exactly the same, but they cover laws that are very similar, whether you're in Babylon or you're in Assyria or you're in Egypt. They're very similar laws that are found on these steles. And it's interesting, what did God write down the Ten Commandments on? He wrote it on 2 tablets of stone. Now, the question that we might ask as a result of this is, why all the similarities between the laws recorded for various Mesopotamian states and Israel? Why are there so many similarities? Now, the scholars have looked at this, and their suggestion is, well, all of these laws are similar because we had traders going back and forth from one area to the other, and they picked up these laws and they brought the laws back, and then they said, hey, that's a good law from over there, we'll put it on our monument. Now, there's no real historical evidence for that. The better assumption for all these similar laws in these early nations is that they came from Noah and his sons. So as they left the ark and mankind began to disperse, they came from a common source. God had revealed to Noah what was right and wrong, what the laws were. And Shem, Ham, and Japheth knew what the laws were. And those laws went with them as they spread out from Mount Ararat north, south, east, and west. So as you find these steles, you find similar laws because they have a similar point of origin. Ultimately, that origin was God. They didn't come about by accident or by the process of evolution, that really doesn't add up. Doesn't add up as you think about evolution, that it's just going to happen, and somehow they're going to come up with these similar laws in various parts of the world. So we see that these laws were established, and we find them all over the Middle East, and that is probably a result of Noah and his sons and the dissemination of those laws from the starting point at the ark They spread out from there. Now let's look at another interesting matter here in Genesis chapter 14, verse 18. Genesis chapter 14, verse 18. It says, "Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine." And this took place after the defeat of the 5 kings who had come over from Mesopotamia and kidnapped and taken all of the goodies from Sodom and Gomorrah, the 5 cities of the plain. So Abraham defeated them, and they came back, and they came to what we would now know as Jerusalem. And there's this king of Salem known as Melchizedek, priest of God Most High. And what did he bring out? As you look in verse 14, it says that he brought out bread and wine. And so who was this? Who was Melchizedek? We don't have a lot of information here. We get a little bit of information here, and we get some information back in Hebrews. And there's a little bit of information in other places. But it's brief. We don't have a lot of information. We would all like to know, how long was he here? What was his role? What did he teach? And we don't know these things. And what we do know is that he was the king of Salem, and he was there in what we would know as Jerusalem around 2,000 years after Adam and Eve, and approximately 2,000 years before the coming of Jesus Christ. And we, in looking at it and looking at combining what it says here and what it says in the book of Hebrews, feel that this was Jesus, the one we know as Jesus Christ. It was Jesus Christ. So we understand it. He was the one who became Christ. He was here on earth. He had a ministry at that time. We don't, as I said, only one other person talks about this being. That's Josephus, and he doesn't tell us a great deal. So he comes out and he brings out wine and bread. So what does that mean? Well, was he feeding all the soldiers? He's giving them wine and bread? Could be. Or does it mean that Melchizedek discussed the meaning of the Passover? Because later on, we know that bread and wine will be used by Jesus Christ as the Passover symbols. And did he discuss the Passover sacrifice and what he would do 2,000 years later? He had called Abraham. He was working with Abraham. Did he discuss these things with Abraham? The Messiah would come and make it possible for Abraham to have his sins forgiven. We don't know. The details aren't here. And if you go on, and to me, what's said here ties in with chapter 15. And because chapter 14 and 15 tie together, it seems to lend credence to the fact that he's talking about the Passover. So we've talked about that before, and anyway, if you look at what takes place there with Abraham and the covenant that is made, you can understand that. In Genesis chapter 14, verse 19, he tells us that the priest of God Most High blessed Abraham on behalf of God. Now, usually it is a superior who blesses the inferior. Abraham here is the inferior. Obviously, the king of Salem is the superior being. And so we might ask, who has the right to bless? It is God who has the right to bless. This was God who was there interacting with Abraham. Verse 20 talks about the tithe being given to this being. Talks about the tithe being given to this being. Now the question we have to ask here is, where did Abraham get the idea of tithing? If we didn't have the Bible, we wouldn't be tithing. All right? We tithe because the Bible instructs us to do so. If we didn't have the Bible, we wouldn't be tithing. The Bible says to tithe. It is a way that we honor God. And Abraham apparently understood this and gave the tithe to Melchizedek. It's not something that he came up with on his own. It's something that he understood. Melchizedek is doing a work, and he honored Melchizedek with a tithe of all that he had gained as a result of defeating the 5 kings. So we have this lawgiver, Melchizedek, who was a priest, and he would offer sacrifices, offerings, and would teach about God and his law. And here's Abraham interacting with him. So we see a couple of things there. We see this being, we see that he's tithed to, and was he talking about the Passover? Maybe. Let's go to Genesis chapter 20. See something else that's interesting here. Genesis chapter 20. Again, this is Abraham, and Abraham hadn't learned his lesson from Egypt about saying that his wife Sarai was he kept saying, she's my sister. And again, it gets him in trouble. It says, and Abraham journeyed from there to the south and dwelt between Kadesh and Shur and stayed in Gerar. Now Abraham said of Sarah his wife, she is my sister. He's not telling the whole truth. He's still not learned this lesson. And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, indeed, you are a dead man, because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife. You're a dead man. I don't think any of us want that dream. So God threatens him. You're a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife. So what's Abimelech's reaction? But Abimelech had not come near her, and he said, Lord, will you slay a righteous nation also? So he responds to God, are you going to destroy my nation? As a result of this, I didn't know any better, in the sense I didn't know she was married. She was a man's wife. Did he not say to me, she is my sister? And she herself said, he is my brother. In the integrity of my heart and innocence of my hands, I have done this. And God said to him in a dream, yes, I know that you did this in the integrity of your heart. For I also withheld you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her. So this man is a Philistine. And at this point in time, he knows something about God. He also knows something about the law of marriage. He knew that it was wrong for him to take another man's wife. And he and his nation were seeking to do the best they could to live the right way. He says in verse 7, now therefore restore the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you shall live. But if you do not restore her, know that you shall surely die, you and all who are yours. So Abimelech rose early in the morning, called his servants, and told all these things in their hearing, and the men were very much afraid. And Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, what have you done to us? How have I offended you, that you have brought on me and on my kingdom a great sin? You have done deeds to me that ought not to be done. Then Abimelech said to Abraham, what did you have in view that you have done this thing? And Abraham replied, because I thought, surely the fear of God is not in this place, and they will kill me on account of my wife. Was the fear of God in that place? Abraham didn't think so when he came there, but actually the fear of God was in that place. Abimelech feared God, and apparently the people of his nation did as well. And she truly was his sister. But he upbraids Abraham because of what he did. What he did was wrong. And you can see that it was wrong. Abraham's lying, and look at what happens as a result of the lie, and you very clearly see the law of marriage in place here again. So, as we move on, let's go to chapter 26. Genesis chapter 26. And in Genesis chapter 26, we again see that the laws of God are functioning and working. And we have the same man. He's much older by this point, Abimelech, and he's interacting with Abraham's son, Isaac. So time has gone on, and he's interacting with Isaac. Let's go to chapter 26, verse 3. 26, verse 3. So it says, "Dwell in the land, and I will be with you and bless you. For to you and your descendants I give all these lands, and I will perform the oath which I swore to Abraham, your father." So God is going to fulfill the promise that he had given to Abraham. Verse 4, "And I will make your descendants multiply as stars of heaven." And so he's going to allow his descendants to multiply as the stars of heaven. He says, "I will give," the second promise, "I will give to your descendants all these lands." I'm going to give you the land. And the third promise, "And in your seed all the nations of the earth will be blessed." And we know that is a promise of the Messiah to come. He would come as part of the seed of Isaac on out into the future. So here we have these promises, verse 5, and then we get to verse 5. It says, "Because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws." So what does verse 5 tell us? It tells us clearly in it that there were statutes and commandments and laws. All of these things were in existence in Abraham's time, and they had been passed on to Isaac. They had all been passed down from generation to generation. They didn't just come up at Mount Sinai. So when somebody tells you there were no laws prior to Mount Sinai, you can say, "Excuse me. Let's go back and look at Genesis 1, and you can just take them right through the scriptures and say, you notice that in Genesis 1 there are laws that govern everything? And as you go through and you talk about Genesis 2 and you look at don't eat of this, there are laws that man must choose to follow or not follow, and there are consequences to not following those laws. And we see the laws as we make our way through the book of Genesis. Let's go to look at our final example here in Genesis chapter 39. It's interesting, and it's important to understand as you look at verse 5, just make one note. How did they pass the laws along? How did they pass the laws along? Did God hand them a piece of stone on which with his finger he had written the laws? That's not what he did. It says, because Abraham obeyed my voice. The laws were passed along from generation to generation, but the primary way they were passed along from generation to generation was by God speaking directly to them. You go back to early on, God walked with Enoch. How did Enoch know what righteousness was? He walked with God. God explained it to him. How did Noah know? Because Noah walked with God. And God explained what's right and wrong, what is righteousness, what is sin, so that Noah understood. So the laws were passed along to a large degree by one generation to another generation, receiving the laws from God and passing them on to the next generation. Let's go to Genesis chapter 39. And this is the account of Joseph. As we've talked about, Joseph is talked about extensively in the book of Genesis. He's the most talked about figure in the book of Genesis in actuality. Let's look at and so Joseph, as we know the story. He was sold into slavery. He was purchased by Potiphar, who had a high position in the kingdom of Egypt. And Joseph rose in rank in the man's house. He was found to be capable. He was found to be diligent. He was found to be honest. And so this man said, I'm going to put the whole house under your hand. I trust that you will do right by me. I can trust what you're going to do, and you'll do it well, and you will not in any way take advantage of me. So that was his boss, Potiphar, but Potiphar's wife wasn't of the same mindset. Potiphar's wife looked upon him, and he was a good-looking young man, and she kept soliciting him to enter into sexual immorality. And Joseph kept refusing her. Now why? Where did he get the idea that adultery was wrong? Where did he get that idea? If you go back earlier in the story, You find Abraham learning that lesson. You don't think that Abraham relayed that lesson? Abraham went through the lesson twice. Hopefully he didn't, and we don't have a record of him doing it a third time. Probably 2 times. He probably said, maybe we just need to be honest here and trust God, and that's what he did. So you see that Joseph knew of the law of marriage. He knew of the 7th commandment. He knew what was the right thing to do, and he did it. You go on a little further and you look at Jacob. We talked about tithing, and as you go through and you look at Jacob, it talks about him understanding about the tithe. So where did Jacob get that? That probably was passed down to him from his grandfather and his father, and they passed these things on to him. So we have this interesting thread through Genesis. The laws we have recounted were well known. The servants of God knew these laws. They were also known by the societies that Abraham operated in. They knew something about these laws. Pharaoh, king of Egypt, Abimelech, they knew the laws came from God. And God set laws into motion of animals. He also set them into motion for people. So God is a God of law. And we can see this from the beginning of the Bible all the way through to the end. We saw the end, didn't we? About the commandments. The sun, moon, stars, plants, and animals all live by laws, and human beings are to live by laws as well. The question that we all have to answer is this: are we going to live by God's laws, the laws that God has given to us? We have free moral agency. The question is, will we live by those laws? So, in a sermon in the future, we will continue this study of God's law, and we will go through some important discussions of the laws God gave to Moses. The first law, which was the 10 Commandments, there was also a second law, the law that was written and put to the side of the ark. We'll talk about those things, seek to better understand them. And as I said, the issue of the law is something that has come up and it will come up again. Are we to keep the laws? And as I bring up different points, you will hear these at some time in the future if you're around the church long enough. Eventually, Satan will allow them to cycle around, and he keeps on using them. If it worked well in the past, he brings it back up and puts it out there and seeks to deceive people about it. So if we're armed and we know about the law and we know that it applies, we will not be deceived. We will have an answer when they come to us and tell us God's law is done away. You'll be ready. You'll be armed, not dangerous, but filled with truth.